Alrighty then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 145. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And I must say 145 is obviously not prime because, in the famous words of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the only number ending in 5 that is prime is 5 itself. So 145 is 5 times 29, and I'm not even sure exactly why I got off on this prime number thing, which has been going for several episodes now, but I did. This is my beverage, and you may notice I'm drinking Starbucks today because my woman and I went to Home Depot to get some mulch and some plants, and Starbucks is just right next door practically. And sometimes you just want to be served a hot beverage by a young transsexual undergoing hormone therapy. And Starbucks is the place to go for that. In fact, there's even I shouldn't even show you what's drawn on the side of the cup, but it does seem to be of a sexual nature. So we'll just skip that. And you'd think Starbucks would be like a classy enough place that they'd put paper umbrellas into their drinks, but I had to provide my own. Such is life. Dukkha takes many forms. So anyhow, I suppose I should just wade right into this. We don't have a whole lot of questions. It's kind of on the lighter side this time. So those of you who don't like 3-hour long Q&A videos or 3.5-hour long ones, today is your lucky day. And so, first question is from Kundru. And Kundru says, why do so many suttas end with Ananda or one of the Buddha's other disciples praising the Buddha in the form of similes? Many of them always seem to end with something along the lines of, excellent Lord Gautama, it is as if... ... And there's a slight misunderstanding here. Kundru is somewhat misunderstanding the situation because when you have this stock ending of somebody, like the Buddha gives a discourse to somebody, or he is just like having a conversation with somebody, and at the end they say this stock phrase, word for word, excellent Sir Gautama, excellent Sir Gautama, just as Sir Gautama, one would set aright what had been tipped over, would reveal what had been covered, would explain the road to one who was lost, or would hold up an oil lamp in the darkness so that those with eyes could see what is visible. Even so, the Dhamma has been shown by Sir Gautama in many ways. I go to Sir Gautama for refuge, and to the Dhamma and to the community of monks. May Sir Gautama consider me to be a lay supporter from this day on. For the rest of my life, I have taken refuge. So that's the stock ending, the stock speech. It's like a stock conversion speech that is just plugged into many suttas. And it's hardly likely that everyone who gets converted to Buddhism by the Buddha is going to give this exact same speech. In fact, other schools of Buddhism, other ancient schools of Buddhism, they plugged in a different stock speech at the end. Just wherever it was a suitable place to plug in this speech, they just plug it in, and each school of Buddhism had its own variation on the speech. And so this is a conversion speech that is just like a traditional thing. The ancient mind is kind of a tradition-oriented mind. And so they just figured, well, I got to have the conversion speech at the end. So it wasn't Ananda or one of the Buddha's other disciples. That particular speech is always given by a layperson or a non-Buddhist, like a non-Buddhist ascetic or something, who had just been converted to Buddhism after talking to the Buddha. So I really don't recall Ananda or one of the Buddha's other disciples praising the Buddha at the end of a sutta like this. I mean, it may happen, but it's not like this stock verbatim paragraph that just gets inserted into sutta after sutta. That is just a conversion speech, and just for some reason it just became traditional to end these suttas where the Buddha is converting somebody to Buddhism with this excellent Sir Gautama, excellent Sir Gautama. It's sort of like most suttas probably begin with evam me suttam, thus have I heard. It's just a traditional thing. So I think I'm just going to move on to Kyundru's second question, which is, which translation of the Dhammapada do you prefer the most? And my favorite translation of the Dhammapada is this one. This is like the Buddhist Publication Society version, or a Buddhist Publication Society version, translated by Acharya Buddharakkhita. And actually, the introduction is by Bhikkhu Bodhi, back when Bhikkhu Bodhi was still living in Sri Lanka and was like some kind of leader of the Buddhist Publication Society. But I haven't read all translations of the Dhammapada. I would assume that there's translations out there that I would like better than this. But of the ones that I have read, this is one of my faves, probably my favorite version. And this is one of the few possessions I have owned since before I became a monk. I acquired this back when I was in my 20s, which was several Kunz ages ago. So, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Quasator. And Quasator says, can you elaborate on how someone entering fourth jhana regularly could change the general consciousness of the universe? Does entering jhana bring more insight into shared consciousness and change belief systems on a subconscious level? That's 2 question marks, isn't it? I mean, that technically should be 2 questions, shouldn't it? But I think altogether he has only 3 question marks, so he's still not exactly transgressive in this, putting 2 question marks into a single question. And that's setting aside cases where you have multiple question marks all together for emphasis. So, Quasator says, can you elaborate on how someone entering fourth jhana regularly could change the general consciousness of the universe? I'm not sure that it could change the general consciousness of the universe, whereas the universe is just everything. So, since the universe in that sense, of just everything, infinite everything, I think it already contains like infinite consciousness and everything. I don't think you could really change the general level of consciousness with regard to that. But with regard to this world, or this version of samsara that we happen to be inhabiting, that it may be what Quasator really had in mind anyway. Though I'm not trying to second guess Quasator. It reminds me of a statement by St. John of the Cross that I have mentioned numerous times, where St. John of the Cross, in one of his books, and St. John of the Cross was a Spanish Roman Catholic, discalced Carmelite. I guess he'd be a monk. He wouldn't be a friar, I think. And he said that you've got 2 people. One person is just like feeding the hungry and clothing the people with not enough clothes and housing the homeless and just tending the sick and just doing all this meritorious stuff at kind of a worldly level. And then the second person is abiding in deep contemplation or high contemplation, which is what the Catholic contemplative order is called, what a Buddhist would call jhana. I'm pretty sure that they're essentially the same, based on what I've read from St. John of the Cross and what I've read in Buddhist texts. So how would the second, St. John of the Cross says these 2 people, one's doing all this worldly meritorious stuff, and the other one is just sitting alone, practicing high contemplation. The second person is helping the world more than the first person. And that is because he is like uplifting like the consciousness center of gravity of the earth, He's adding higher consciousness, just sort of injecting it or inoculating it into this global system that we're living in. And I mean, how someone entering fourth jhana could change the general consciousness of the world is simply the fact that all consciousness ultimately is connected. So by uplifting your own consciousness, it has an effect on the consciousness of the beings around you. And mental states are contagious. I mean, it should be fairly obvious. You've got somebody who's like really upset or depressed, and they don't even have to be yelling or crying or anything. They can just be sitting there, and it's going to have like a dampening effect on the spirit of the room in general, the other people in the room. On the other hand, someone could just come right out of like a meditation center, and they're just sort of radiating contentment. They're practically shining, and they can just be sitting there quietly too, and that's going to have an effect on everyone else in the room. And it's just, there's like this subliminal empathy that we have, and animals have it too. Maybe that all conscious beings have this, just deep down, maybe at a subconscious level, there's sort of an awareness of the consciousness of other people, because ultimately the consciousness isn't separate. It's perception that separates it. So I guess I should read the second half of this question, which has its own question mark. Does entering jhana bring more insight into shared consciousness and change belief systems on a subconscious level? I don't think it would directly change belief systems, but it would sort of increase the level of wisdom to some degree. And sort of one thing that just came to mind is the beginning of, I think it's Victor Hugo's novels, Les Miserables. I don't know how to pronounce French names. I'll just deliberately mispronounce it as Les Miserables, where you had Jean Valjean, who just gets out of prison, I think, and he's like a hardened criminal, and he steals something from this kind-hearted Catholic priest, and then he gets caught. He steals some silver candlesticks. The priest just lets him stay there, just out of the generosity of his heart, goodwill in general. Jean Valjean steals these candlesticks and takes off, and a police officer sees him taking off with it, arrests him, and brings him back to the priest, and the priest just pretty much just lies and says, "No, I gave those to him. He didn't steal anything." And it just changes the way Jean Valjean thinks. It's like this person did him a kindness for no reason, really. I mean, he shouldn't have done this kindness. He should have gotten revenge or whatever, and he didn't. And it just sort of like opened up this awareness of a new way of being, a new way for him anyway, that just caused him to like move in a different direction. And so, I mean, it wasn't like the priest did anything directly to change his belief systems. It was just that Jean Valjean was just coming into contact with like a saintly person, and that just sort of uplifted him. It like gave him an opportunity that he wouldn't have gotten if the priest just like, "Yeah, he ripped me off, arrest him, officer," that kind of thing. And that can happen at a more subtle level where you're not even coming into physical contact with the other person. It's much more subtle that way. But still, it's not like this direct changing of beliefs, anything like that. It's just sort of kind of uplifting the general consciousness of the world, so to speak. And it kind of reminds me of the Old Testament scene of, the God would spare a city just for the sake of one righteous man living there. And in a way, having saints in this world, it kind of increases the merit, or the sort of, it makes really bad things less likely to happen, because these saintly people don't have the bad karma to be living, for example, in a thermonuclear holocaust and radioactive wasteland, something like that. So the more saintly people you've got, the less likely it is that something horrible is going to happen. And that can kind of help uplift people too, just with general contentment instead of general misery. And I'm just going to move on to Quasitor's next question. And in parentheses, he's got a follow-up question to see if any part of karma has to do with suffering inflicted or if it's essentially only in your mind. I think this is a follow-up question to a different question that somebody had already asked, which I think is going to be lower down on the list simply because Quasitor asked the first question and then he waited some time before asking this subsequent question after other people had already asked. That's how it works. So anyways, Quasitor says, if you get angry at an AI and act aggressively towards it with the belief that they are conscious and consider them to be similar to a human, thinking that you can hurt their feelings, would you be generating karma similar to if you had offended a human? And this is kind of similar to a question I was asked in the previous Q&A about like people falling in love with AI generated mates, where the AI generated mate, I mean, they don't really have a physical body yet, but still they can say all the romantic stuff and, you know, at least simulate someone who understands your problem and understands your problems and sympathizes and so forth. Offers you consolation, helps you not to be lonely, this kind of thing. And so it reminds me of that. And it's kind of a similar question. So you get pissed off at an AI, artificial intelligence, and you're like, you're insulting it, you know, you're cursing the AI, and you think that you just assume that the AI can't have its feelings hurt, which probably can't. Then yeah, you're making karma, but it's not necessarily as bad of karma as actually hurting a real person's feelings. Because when you're actually hurting a real person's feelings, there's like this feedback going back. Their consciousness or their mental states are kind of feeding back on you, you know, and then there's that deeper down level where everyone is more or less empathic or telepathic, and there's this connection, so that when you hurt somebody, deep down you feel that you're hurting yourself because you're hurting this sort of the group consciousness or the group mind of your environment. So, I mean, the trying to insult an AI is like a midpoint between insulting a real person and just like cursing an inanimate object. And I have done that plenty. I have cursed the forklift that I drive because, you know, it's just not working right. Or it's like you get the forks underneath a pallet and it's not lifted up high enough so that the forks slide into it and kind of lift it up off the ground so you can't pull the forks back out. You just pull the pallet when you back up. Then I can just be cursing that pallet. You stupid son of a bitch kind of stuff. And I mean, obviously you're making karma. You're pissed off, just or irritated or annoyed or whatever. You just feel like cussing. And I mean, you're making karma by doing that. It's like the most abstract thoughts are making karma. Your own thoughts are making karma. The belief that you have insulted a being that doesn't really exist, or I mean, I've talked about this sort of thing before too. Like you try to shoot somebody, you shoot them, they fall down, you take off, you think that you killed them, when really they just they were like startled by the sudden noise of the gun going off and slip and fall, and they're actually fine. So, I mean, you don't make the same kind of karma as if you actually killed the person, just due to like the feedback of their own mental states with your mental states, which are happening at a level below like the ordinary conscious level. So it's a one-way kind of karma. There's the AI really isn't. I mean, maybe the AI is programmed to like insult you back, something like that, which could then escalate so that you could have this screaming match towards this artificial intelligence that really isn't feeling anything at all. So there's a few complications involved, but still, I mean, mainly karma is volition, karma is urge, karma is will, and the will to insult another being is going to be bad karma, akusala karma, unskillful action. It's just that when you're doing it towards an inanimate object or some object that just isn't conscious, then it's going to be one-sided, and there's not going to be any kind of feedback loops going on or like subconscious empathy that are like acting as complications that can add to the karma. So I hope I answered that question, because I'm moving on to the next one. This is from Cleefy. And Cleefy says, what Buddhist school would be better suited for Westerners? And it depends on the Westerners. I mean, like Buddhism has moved into the West. It did that quite a while ago. And some Westerners prefer Zen, and some Westerners prefer Theravada, or rather Vipassana. Some Westerners prefer Tibetan Buddhism. And, it just, one of the main determinants is just, what teacher is the wisest? You could have like a really advanced Zen teacher and just sort of a Theravada or Vipassana teacher who's just teaching you stuff from a book that they really don't have personal experience in much of what they're teaching. That happens in Burma all the time, by the way. So, I mean, you'd be better off with a Zen Roshi than a Theravada monk, just if the Zen Roshi just happens to be wiser, that he's better suited to be your teacher. But with regard to schools of Buddhism in general, what would be best for Westerners in general? Theravada maybe, but if you're even including extinct schools, then probably Sautrantika would work better for Westerners than Theravada. Or one of the Mahasangika schools that wasn't as materialistic and wasn't as essentialist as like as Theravada is. Theravada believes in swabhava, or self-nature, self-essence. Like, it doesn't believe that a person has this swabhava or self-existence, but they do believe that the tiniest particles of like anything real, like matter or mental states or whatever, that those have their own self-existence. And that is probably a step away from what the Buddha was really teaching. That the Buddha was probably more in agreement with the Mahayanist point of view, that even the tiniest particles of matter or the tiniest units of mentality, even they do not have this like essential self-existence, this ultimately real self-existence, or ultimately real existence in general. Just get rid of the problematic word self. That they have their own existence. So there's a good chance that some of the extinct, like so-called Hinayana, the early schools of Buddhism would be preferable to Theravada. But then again, I mean, so long as you can accept like the Pure Land stuff and all the mythology and that sort of obviously like apocryphal texts and so forth, then, I mean, Zen is good too. But Zen does have a lot more sort of apocrypha added to it. Let's see. Tibetan Buddhism, it never really appealed to me. It's just too kind of garish, maybe. Just, it's got too many complications, even though you eventually penetrate the complications and you get into like Dzogchen or something, which is very similar to what is being taught in some of the earliest texts. So it reminds me of a Buddhist cartoon I saw a long time ago. Had 3 meditators all sitting in a line. One of them was a Vipassana meditator, which is like some woman with a shawl. And then next was a Zen meditator who was like a Zen monk with the pajamas and the bald head. And then the third was a Tibetan meditator who I think was like a guy in a business suit. And so the Theravada meditator has just this ordinary thought balloon coming out that is empty, just blank. Then the Zen meditator has a more like Chinese ink painting kind of, the paintbrush, the ink in the paintbrush kind of Zen thought balloon coming out. And it also is just empty. And then finally, the Tibetan meditator has got this really ornate curly-Q kind of, sort of paisley sort of looking thought balloon, which also is empty. So, I mean, Westerners generally don't have much use for faith. If they do have a use for faith, generally they're Christians. You've already got, your culture already supplies you with this faith-based belief system that if you're just devotionalistic by nature, you can just go for that. So it's like Westerners, a lot of Westerners who tend to be more of the scientific temperament than the artistic, or the philosophical temperament than the religious. They like Buddhism just because it explains things nicely. A lot of like engineer types like Theravada Buddhism because it's so systematic. And again, there's not a lot of fairy tales that you're really required to believe. There's fairy tales in the text. It's just that they're irrelevant to the central message of Buddhism. So it seems like early Buddhism would be better than later Buddhism as a general rule. But I mean, it's such a hard question to answer because there's so many ways of interpreting it, so many different ways of looking at it. Like what would be best suited to Westerners might be just some sort of very corrupt, watered down, very materialistic, politicized kind of Buddhism, which is, there's plenty of that around. But I assume Khalifi means by better suited is like most beneficial and, sort of acceptable and beneficial, like the best combination of those two. So, yeah, I would guess it would be maybe Sautrantika, or if you're not including like extinct ancient schools of Buddhism, then Theravada, I guess. Or maybe some kind of Zen that goes real easy on the sort of the extra added stuff, like the Pure Land elements. A lot, maybe most Zen has incorporated Pure Land into it, which really did not inspire me to want to be a Zen monk after I realized this fact. That kind of thing. But I mean, if Zen were like the koan collections where you've just got these people dressed in black standing around talking in riddles and hitting people with sticks, then that might appeal to a certain kind of Western mentality, although hitting people with sticks is very much frowned upon in a much more feminized, kinder, gentler sort of Western civilization. So let's just say Theravada and move on to the next question. Next question is from Jules. And am I recording? Yep. Certainly looks that way. Jules says, did you ever come across the phantom leaf experiment before? Have you ever had any type of perceptive experience where this light body or aura of objects is observed? And I came across the phantom leaf experiment back when I was a kid because my father was he went through this phase of being fascinated by Kirlian photography. And so I've seen lots of photographs of Kirlian photography, including the phantom leaf, where you take a leaf and I think the way it works, Kirlian photography, I've never really understood it very well, but I think there's like supercharged with an electric field or something. And then you take a picture and there's like this aura around the leaf or any living thing, really. Then you like tear off a piece of the leaf or you cut off a piece of the leaf. You put the leaf, you take the same picture, and it's not the aura is going around the actual outline of this torn or cut leaf. There's like the outline is shaped like the original leaf. That somehow that there's some life force or something there that is still causing the leaf to have an aura that is like the shape of the undamaged leaf. Another kind of experiment that I really liked as a kid that kind of, well, anyway, it stands out in my memory was a man and a woman would press their finger up against like a pane of glass. And there'd be a Kirlian photograph of these two fingertips up against the glass, and it's got like the little aura around each fingertip. And then the man and the woman kiss while their fingers are still there, and the aura just blazes. It gets way bigger and brighter. So, I never really understood Kirlian photography very well. So, that's kind of a handicap to me in answering this question. Although, the first question mark here, have I ever come across the phantom leaf experiment? Yes. Back when I was a kid, when my father was studying up on Kirlian photography and auras in general. And then the second part of this question, have you ever had any type of perceptive experience where this light body or aura of objects is observed? No, I've never really been able to see auras, although my father claimed that he could see auras, and he claimed that he could tell when someone is lying because their aura would change color. There's different colors of auras and so forth. And whether that is the same sort of phenomenon as is recorded in Kirlian photography, I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what an aura is composed of. That's like the origination of like the halos around the heads of saints or around in the nimbus shining from the Buddha. All of those presumably would be some sort of aura, which might be the same thing being recorded in Kirlian photography for all I know. So my father claimed to see auras. I've never been able to see auras. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And Siddhartha Lohachita says, during your stay in Burma, did you meet any World War II veterans? Are there still bombs in some parts of the jungle? From the Burmese point of view, the Japanese were the good guys? That's 3 questions right there, and I haven't got to the end yet. Even though, as they did throughout all Asia, they installed a puppet military dictatorship. So you're not tricking me by putting like multiple questions together in the form of one question. So anyways, so did I meet any World War II veterans? I don't recall meeting World War II veterans. I've met people who were old enough that they recalled British times. Like one of my main supporters, he was the son of a mayor of Rangoon, a Burmese mayor of Rangoon, and he spoke English with this upper crusty British accent. So a lot of the older Burmese people, like older educated Burmese people, would speak English with like an upper crusty British accent. Whereas when you get into like Gen X or, sort of my age even, then they'd start speaking, when they'd speak English, it would be more with an American accent, because by that time, it wasn't the British Empire anymore. It wasn't part of the British Raj, but instead you had American Christian missionaries running Christian schools that people would send their kids to, even though they were devout Buddhists, and they remained devout Buddhists, just to get a good education. And so they would learn to speak English with an American accent. But with regard to the closest I came to a World War II veteran, maybe, was back in the 90s, I was interacting with a Burmese monk who was a retired surgeon, and he was doing missionary work in Japan. He learned how to speak Japanese during the Japanese occupation of Burma in World War II. And he always had this liking for the Japanese because the Japanese soldiers liked him. They were kind to him. And so, he kind of left a good impression on this boy so that he can sort of continued liking the Japanese and wanted to go to Japan and teach Theravada Buddhism, teach Dhamma there. So, yeah, he eventually talked me into going to Japan with him once. I spent the Rains Retreat of 1997 or 98 in Japan. So that's my answer to the first part of Siddhartha Lohachita's question. See, are there still bombs in some parts of the jungle? I assume there would be, although the only bombs I saw in Burma were bomb casings that were used as monastery bells. That quite a few monasteries in Burma will have like World War II era, like dud bombs that just didn't explode as monastery bells. They're just hanging from a rope and you beat on them with a mallet or something and it calls the monks to the meditation hall, or it's announcing it's time to leave for alms round, that sort of thing. So, but I would assume there's still bombs out in the jungle, but I just never came across any. And then the third part of this first question, from the Burmese point of view, the Japanese were the good guys? No, not really. That monk that I met who had good experiences with Japanese soldiers, there were probably some. But like when the Burmese talk about Patsit Kit, which is the fascist era, when they're talking about the time of fascism in Burma, they're talking about the Japanese occupation. So the way it worked was the Burmese considered the British to be the bad guys during the time of colonialism. We're getting into like the 1930s where there's more of a nationalist movement among these colonial possessions of, the European powers. And so you had especially young, malcontented men who just, they're kind of angry, they're not very happy, and so they just blame the British for it. And it's extremely common in this world that you're not happy, so you just blame somebody else for it. And to sometimes you could say, well, yeah, okay, like you've got a woman who's living with an abusive husband who's beating on her, that sort of thing. That's one thing. But the British Empire was relatively well run, and it was relatively humanely run. In fact, it was more humanely run, and the people prospered more after the British took over than before. Like, there was a time when the British ruled southern or lower Burma, and the Burmese kings still ruled upper Burma. And there was just this migration of Burmese people migrating from the Burmese upper Burma to the British run lower Burma, just because it was more prosperous. And you weren't as likely, you had human rights under the British, which you didn't have under the Burmese kings. In fact, one of the reasons why the British invaded Upper Burma, or rather, one of the main propaganda reasons to get the people in England behind this was pointing out that, it's a true story, as far as I know, that the king's astrologer told him that the current capital city, which I think was Mandalay at the time, it's running out of juju, that you're going to have to move the capital again. And that was a pretty common thing. In fact, it happened just relatively recently when the capital of Burma got moved from Rangoon to Naypyidaw. The capital of Burma is now Naypyidaw. And that was going on for a long time, and it was largely for astrological reasons, where the fortune teller says, we've sucked up all the manna out of the ground here, or whatever. We're going to have to move the capital. And so it moved a lot. But the king King Thibault, I think was his name. He wasn't a particularly intelligent person, but he had enough sense to realize that they just could not afford to move the capital, just pull up stakes, move everything to a different city, maybe even build a whole new city. So instead, he decided to compromise by having, I think it was like 400 people buried alive around the precincts of like the central city, the Acropolis, sort of like where the king's palace was and everything. They had walls around that. You can still go and see the walls in Mandalay. And it just caused this exodus of people, fleeing Mandalay because, of course, they considered themselves unworthy to be buried alive and turned into a kind of guardian spirit for protecting the area. So, the British, they had their moments of inhumanity and all that, but they weren't just burying people alive for superstitious reasons, for example. So, but anyways, getting back to the story I was starting to tell, in that the Burmese resented the British because they just thought they were going to become this glorious utopia without British rule. And so at the beginning of World War II, there were a group of sort of Burmese resistance leaders, including Aung San, who became like the father of independent Burma, went to Japan to receive training on how to be like insurgent fighters and, sort of essentially terrorists. And so they came back and they were fighting for the Japanese. And they helped the Japanese to some degree to drive out the British, which did happen. The British were driven out of Burma. And then the Japanese established, this kind of mini dictatorship there. And then the Burmese realized that they were better off under the British because the Japanese were much more ruthless, less compassionate, were less concerned with justice and human rights than the British were. So then, like Aung San, he switches sides again. He goes back to helping the British. And then the British finally drive the Japanese out with the help of the Americans. And Aung San, he gets to be the first president of independent Burma, but then he's assassinated immediately. So from the Burmese point of view, the easy answer is no, the Japanese were not the good guys. They were considered to be worse than the British. So I'm just going to move on to Siddhartha Lohachita's second question. Do you know the story of the Baron Ungern von Sternberg, a German with Russian nationality who installed a brutal theocracy in Mongolia, became the dictator and wanted to create some kind of Shambhala empire, uniting the Tibet, Mongolia, and Central Asia under an absolutist Vajrayana monarchy? I've read a little bit about him. I've heard about him. I know generally who he was, but I'm not familiar with his biography. It seems like he may have been inspired by Rudyard Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King. Because he was trying the same sort of thing, essentially. But yeah, I've heard a little bit about it, but apparently he did not succeed in his attempts. He probably sort of like the guys in The Man Who Would Be King. They kind of start getting set up and then they mess up and then they're destroyed. I would assume that it would be something along those lines happened with the Baron too. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Jaunty John. John spelled Jaun. And Jaunty John says, what do you think about the cases of people that have no visual imagination, and it's called aphantasia, and no internal monologue? It appears to be a quite widespread, barely studied phenomenon on a spectrum from a no verbal internal monologue to not even abstract conscious monologue at all, in context of Buddhist practice like meditation, etc. Yeah, I've heard about people that do not have an internal monologue. And it's hard for me to imagine it may help to account for why, like, simple subsistence farmers living in a village in, third or fourth world Asia, they can get into deep meditative states that when a Westerner is still at the pain in the knee stage, because they don't have wandering mind. I mean, it's like they just don't think very much. I mean, I assume in order for a human to be pretty much sentient in a human sense, they'd have to be able to think at least when they're trying to think. What should I have for dinner? How should I tie up the cows tonight? This kind of thing. I mean, they must have some kind of thoughts going on in their head, even verbal thoughts. It just may be that when they don't have some specific task at hand, they just go silent. And that may be one reason why people in third world countries especially love to have loudspeakers just blasting in the village, because their head's kind of empty. It's not like they can't hear themselves think. It's just that they're kind of accepting this noise as a kind of substitute for thinking. That's one hypothesis I came up with after living in Burma for many years, being exposed to blasting loudspeakers. Just about every village has got at least one blasting loudspeaker, playing cheesy Burmese pop music or monks chanting or just announcements, that kind of stuff, which can sometimes start at 3:30 in the afternoon, or if they're doing a patanpui, it can just be 24/7. So let's see here. What do I think about the cases of people having no visual imagination? Gosh, I mean, they'd have to dream. Even an animal has dreams where they've got like visual images. So I'm not exactly sure how they're measuring this, how they're determining this kind of stuff. Because it would seem like even a person who supposedly has no visual imagination and no internal dialogue, they'd still be able to think in words if they got some reason to think in words, and they're probably still having images at night when they're dreaming. Although I've also read that many, if not most people, dream in black and white, which is not the case with me. So, let's see. It appears to be quite widespread, barely studied phenomenon on a spectrum from no verbal internal monologue to not even abstract conscious monologue at all. Yeah, I mean, I really don't have a lot of personal experience with that. I mean, some people are more simple-minded than others, and simple-minded in that context is not necessarily a pejorative. I mean, some people are just better off being simple-minded, more simple-hearted, I guess. So he wants me to discuss this, or what I think about it, in a context of Buddhist practice like meditation. Well, I've already pointed out that some people who just don't think very much become really good meditators, at least with regard to samatha. They might not be as good at getting insight, because insight may require some kind of thinking. Like, I mean, in Zen Buddhism, if you're dealing with a koan, then you have to be thinking. That's your meditation involves thinking, or just breathing in and out. Then, I mean, there's still some thinking, especially at the beginning level. So it can make people better samatha meditators, but it may be a handicap with regard to the arising of insight. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mr. Pranav. And Mr. Pranav says, is the three marks of existence human-centric? I can't seem to understanding how the mark of dukkha applies to non-living things like a rock or a cup, etc. Is it dukkha because if the cup breaks, the owner gets sad? Well, I mean, dukkha is a mental state. And as far as I know, rocks don't have mental states. Cups don't have mental states. But largely because they don't have mental states, they also don't differentiate themselves from their surroundings. And so, from that point of view, a rock or a cup simply does not exist as any kind of entity unless some conscious being is perceiving it. So, I mean, dukkha, obviously, a rock or a cup itself is not going to suffer. but the person perceiving the rock or the cup and thereby causing that rock or cup to become some discernible entity, it's like what is fueling our existence in samsara is this restless dissatisfaction, which is largely what karma is. Just this momentum of mental states just kind of shoving us through samsara. Or like in some of the earlier texts, it's the thorn in the heart. That, I mean, you can't fully relax. You can't fully be content. You're just driven through life by this restless dissatisfaction, essentially. And even like modern biology, like cognitive science, agrees with this. That I read a book, I think it was The Tangled Wing, like biological constraints on the human spirit by, I think his name was Melvin Conner, who said that, I mean, like fear and just desire, I want, is just driving us through life, even though the desire may not even, I mean, it just may be this ambiguous, you don't even know what it is you want, really. It's just wanting. That's like from a biologist. So, yeah, I mean, a rock or a cup is dukkha because that rock or cup exists as any kind of distinct entity only through a mind perceiving it. And there is no rock or cup there other than potentially if no one is perceiving it. And it's a mental state. And obviously dukkha has to be a mental state. It would only really apply to conscious beings, but a world of multiplicity also applies only to conscious beings because it requires perception to divide things up, to distinguish things. So, I hope I answered that question because I'm moving on to the next one. This is from Fred. And Fred says, what is the ego really? And one way of looking at that question is, I mean, it depends on the definition. That ego is not, I mean, it has more than one possible meaning. Although, I mean, ego literally means I in Latin, I'm pretty sure. Like cogito, no, that's different. That's ergo. Never mind. But the ego really is sort of like self-consciousness. You know, it's, I think, according to Freudian psychology, who I think Freud was maybe the person that really got the word ego into the English language, that, you know, it's sort of like the feeling of identity, or it includes the feeling of identity. It's sort of like your self-awareness, not really awareness in general, but like a self-image, have, you know, this idea of yourself as an individual person kind of a thing. Yeah, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, it'd just be like the conceit I am. I, me, mine would all be like egoistic. But I suppose it would depend on who you talk to, because the word ego is not defined exactly the same by everybody, and it has multiple meanings in the dictionary. So I'm going to move on to Fred's second question, which is, how much weight does karma have for enjoying and sharing someone's pleasure, for example, pornography? Okay, how much weight does karma have? Fred asks difficult questions to understand sometimes. In fact, sometimes I'm not really sure if he's really asking a question. But this one definitely has a clearly discernible question mark at the end. So how much weight does karma have for enjoying and sharing someone's pleasure, apparently somebody else's pleasure, e.g. pornography? And I guess the people in porn, I mean, they are experiencing some pleasure. I wouldn't consider them to be generally happy people, relatively speaking. Maybe a few are. But I really do not fully understand this question. How much weight does karma have for enjoying and sharing someone's pleasure? Well, I mean, enjoying and sharing someone's pleasure would technically be mudita. And it's considered to be a wholesome mental state but that would be different from getting pleasure from watching porn, because you're not so much getting pleasure from the pleasure of the people in the video, so much as you're just getting pleasure from getting your animal mating instincts kind of lit up by seeing, some healthy, well-proportioned member of the opposite sex at the peak of breeding age. So, I mean, if you do take pleasure in somebody else's pleasure, that would be mudita, that would be meritorious, you would be getting good karma for that. If you're just like getting pleasure from watching two people fornicating, without really any kind of like empathy or any such thing, then that would be more of an unwholesome mental state. I mean, you would be cashing in past good karma, because any pleasure that you feel is the fruition of wholesome karma, or like good karma. So I'm not exactly sure what the question really is asking, though. How much weight does karma have for enjoying and sharing someone's pleasure? Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what that means, although I did give it a shot in a kind of nebulous, roundabout way of trying to answer that question. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is kind of along the same vein here. This is from Siovak and Sipad Zidana, who says, why is sexuality focused much more of the sensual pleasure, while gardens, art, food porn, etc. is seen as A-OK in Buddhist circles, despite also being sensuality? I even remember a verse from the Theravada where Mahakassapa, the literal patron saint of asceticism, is talking about the beauty of the natural place he practices and how it is refreshing. So I guess there's a little bit to unpack here. With regard to sexuality, that is one of the main desires that a person has. And so it's one of the main kinds of desire that is really dealt with in the Pali texts. Certainly not the only kind of pleasure, but really it gets a lot of emphasis just because it's one of the strongest desires for pleasure that people have. That and food, I guess. Those would be the main two. And so he says gardens, art, food porn, etc. is seen as A-OK in Buddhist circles, but it's not seen as A-OK in the Pali texts. I mean, that's just a sort of a degeneration of Buddhism. Like, I used to have this idea, if I ever had my own monastery back when I was a monk, then I certainly would not have beautiful flower beds, landscaped gardens and all this, which is what you generally find. Like, you even look in like some of these Buddhist magazines, and it's advertising meditation centers, and it's always talking about how beautiful the grounds are and everything. And I mean, that's not what Theravada Buddhism teaches. That's not what the texts say, that you should avoid that kind of stuff. You'd be better off with decomposing corpses scattered around your monastery than having flowering plants and gardens and this kind of thing. So, I mean, going back with the Pali text, then all pleasures should be kept to a minimum, except for just the joy of meditation. That even necessary pleasures like eating, sleeping, and bathing should be kept to a minimum. And you should just avoid the beautiful in that sense. I think the Rahula Sutta of the Sutta Nipata kind of explains the proper attitude with regard to that. So sexuality is focused on much more than like art and food and so forth, simply because partly it was just ancient Indian culture, and that monks are supposed to be celibate. And so you have to I mean, they didn't have to refrain from food, but they did have to refrain from sex. And it's a very strong temptation. And so they were just continually pounding away at that, just because it's really one of the main sources of desire and also just unenlightened neurosis in humans. But so, I mean, when it has moved to the West, or it has just become decadent, so that you've got monks that really are not practicing conscientiously, but are just following along with the tradition, then you wind up with beautiful grounds and landscaped gardens and monks, eating delicious food. And they got Buddhist art that's very pretty on the walls, this kind of stuff. And I mean, that would not have been approved of in the times of the earliest Buddhism. That's just kind of a decline, or what you naturally expect when a system set up originally for advanced renunciant ascetics becomes like a national religion where pretty much everybody's a Buddhist, so that even the most foolish people are Buddhists, and they're going to need something that's going to have something for them at sort of like this crude level. And I mean, in the West also, like I kind of was mentioning with regard to the meditation centers that are advertised in the Buddhist magazines, it's just the middle path between self-indulgence and self-torture. Very few people veer off towards the self-torture. Almost everybody is veering over to the self-indulgence side, including most monks. So, let's see, Siovac says he even remembers a verse from the Theravada where Mahakassapa, who was like the most ascetic of the Buddha's chief disciples, or his great disciples, is talking about the beauty of the natural place he practices and how it is refreshing. Well, yeah, I mean, that's certainly not as unwholesome of an appreciation as appreciating like a female naked body. So to some degree, I mean, nature is beautiful, unless you look at it real close and then you see that a forest is a battlefield with everything trying to kill something else. But still, it's taking you away from the artificiality of the rat race, humanity, squalid humanity, and even in villages, let alone towns. And, it's just sort of a kind of freedom, which is good. So, but whether Mahakassapa was actually praising the beauty of the natural places where he practices, I don't know. The Theravada and the Theravada both have a reputation for having been composed long after, I mean, at least a lot of it was composed long after the Buddha's time. But in the Pali text, it does say that a monk should he should go out into the forest. I mean you got to go somewhere. And so you go out into a forest, but I mean, you should not be like enjoying physical beauty. That monks are warned against that. That's all sensuality. That's like a stumbling block. It's going to keep you from becoming enlightened. So I'm just going to move on to Siovac and Sipat Zirina's second question, which is, please explain the concept of Brahmacariya. And in Buddhism, Brahmacariya mainly means, sometimes it's translated as the holy life. Mainly it means celibacy, but also it can mean just the life of a renunciant who is, living a life of Dhamma, striving towards enlightenment, that sort of thing. But more narrowly, it means celibacy. And Brahmacariya apparently is one of the words that the Buddha sort of hijacked from the Vedic tradition and redefined it. And on the Discord server in past recent weeks, there has been some discussion of like Mahayana Buddhists taking earlier Buddhist terms and redefining them, like bodhisattva, for example, And I mean, in a way, you could see it as like reprehensible that the Mahayana Buddhists are just taking older Buddhist terms the way the Buddha used them, apparently, and just giving different meanings to them. Whereas, I mean, the Theravada Buddhists, or just the Buddha himself, apparently took like Vedic terms and just gave them completely new definitions. And so this Brahmacariya in like the Vedic traditions, in what is now called Hinduism, that was like the first stage in life of a devout Hindu. The first ashrama dharma, it's like you started off as the celibate student. That's the Brahmacharya phase, where you are a student of the Vedas mainly. I mean, you study other things besides just the Vedic texts. There's a list of the things that like a young Brahmin would have to study, for example. And then the next stage would be the householder. And then the next stage would be like the renunciant, who is just like a hermit, like someone who goes to the forest. They're just kind of living alone in a hut. Maybe their grown children are supporting them as they just meditate or pray out in this hut in the forest by themselves. Maybe they take their wife, just an elderly couple who have more or less renounced sociality. And then finally, there's the sannyasi, or there's the wandering ascetic would be the final stage that probably most Hindus never get to. In fact, nowadays, most Hindus probably don't bother with these 4 ashrama dharmas anyway. But originally, Brahmacharya was sort of like, sometimes in translations called the Brahma faring. Usually the holy life works better, but they're going towards Brahma. That's what it literally means is, Brahma going. So they're kind of moving towards Brahma, who is like the chief god in the Hindu pantheon, in a sense. At least at one time, he kind of still is. But mainly, Hinduism has been taken over by Vaishnavites and Shaivites, who are saying that Vishnu is the highest god, or Shiva is the highest god. But Brahma was like, he was like the personification of ultimate reality. So in a sense, Brahma still is pretty much the highest god. I think in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna claims that he is Brahma and Shiva and Vishnu. It's the Hindus they have a strange approach to theology, let's say. So, I mean, you took the early Vedic term of just sort of going to Brahma, however that was specifically interpreted, and then the Buddha just sort of retranslated it. He took the same term and then it still means it still involves celibacy, but he just kind of turns it into the holy life of renunciants in general, how they're going towards reality, they're going towards holiness, that kind of thing. And that's about as good of an explanation as you're going to get out of me right now. Hyped up on caffeine as I am. And so I'm just going to move on to Siovakchin Sipad Zirna's third question, which is, what does religion mean to you? Everyone seems to have a different definition of what the term means. Most people don't have any definition at all. Anyways, I just interrupted myself. Everyone seems to have a different definition of what the term means, and are often contradictory, exclusionary, or defined in a way that pushes a certain goal the person has. Well, like I told him in the Discord server, if I were going to use one word to differentiate religion from philosophy, it would be worship. That religion is worshipy, it is devotionalistic. Whereas philosophy is not necessarily worshipy or devotionalistic. To the extent that it is worshipy and devotionalistic, it is becoming a religion. Anyways, I looked it up in my dictionary, and it says that religion is the belief in and worship of a superhuman power or powers, especially a god or gods. And I can accept that. And it's got worship, it's got belief and worship right there in the definition. So yeah, religion is devotionalistic. It can be very philosophical, but so long as you've got worship or devotionalism, then it's going to be more of a religion than just a philosophy. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid has asked 3 rather odd questions. First question, why is violence sometimes beautiful? And I mean, beauty is not something that exists objectively. That you got a chemist who, let's say, he's going to analyze the components of some flour. So he just breaks down that flour into its component parts. It's got so much of, cellulose, and it's got water, and it's got, magnesium in it, and this kind of thing. He's not going to isolate out any beauty. He's not going to find any beauty when he breaks this thing down into its component parts. The beauty is like a projection from a perceiving mind. Beauty and ugliness, it's just the duality generated by a perceiving mind, and it's largely influenced by animal instincts and so forth. So why is violence sometimes beautiful? It's just that you've got some person who just somehow considers a certain kind of violence to be beautiful. Like, for example, a bullfight. You've got a really good matador who's very graceful. They're just fearless. The horns of the bull are coming within an inch of his body as he lets it go by. That might be seen as beautiful. Some people see just a raging battlefield as beautiful, sort of like a raging stormy sea or a raging electrical storm. Just the sheer power of it is seen as beautiful in a very dangerous sort of way. A tiger with its mouth covered with blood might be seen as beautiful, as it has just finished eating a deer or some such. But the beauty of it is a projection from some perceiving mind, and 2 people can look at the same thing, and one person will see it as ugly and another person will see it as beautiful. So violence is sometimes beautiful because of the individual quirks of the beholder. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Some people have a more violent mind and have more of an appreciation for violence, so they might see certain kinds of violence as beautiful, whereas like some very saintly person who takes ahimsa extremely seriously, who wouldn't hurt a fly, they might see all violence as ugly. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's second question, which is, what separates beautiful violence from disgusting violence? And again, it is the attitude of the viewer. That there is no beautiful violence or disgusting violence existing out there that isn't being perceived. That beauty or disgustingness, they're just not out there in some material world. They are matters of attitude in the viewer. So again, one person can look at violence and consider it beautiful, and another one can look at the very same violence and consider it disgusting. It's just individual quirks in a perceiving mind. So I'm going to move on to Xenothoid's third question, which is, did the burning monk die a beautiful, glorious death? And he's referring to the famous Vietnamese monk who lit himself on fire to protest the South Vietnamese Christian government that was, in a way, I guess, like biased against the Buddhist majority, that kind of thing. And did he die a beautiful, glorious death? Again, it depends on who you talk to, because it is a value judgment. It is just an individual judgment with not really based on objectivity. So some people would look at that and consider it a beautiful, glorious death. And there were people, like when this monk was burning, that actually came and like bowed to him. They were in just reverence at what he was doing. But other people would just be appalled, like the lady in that Ingmar Bergman movie, Persona, who has to be institutionalized after seeing this monk burning himself alive on television, like on the news. It's an old movie. So again, it just depends on who you talk to, and it's all matters of opinion. It's not some kind of just objective this is the way it is. It's going to depend on the attitude of whoever is observing whatever it is to determine whether they see it as beautiful or disgusting or glorious or inglorious. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Harim Cthul. And Harim Cthul asks a kind of unusual, interesting question, which is, did modern science develop because magic is not as powerful in the Kali Yuga? And that's an intriguing question, I think. Although, I mean, the Indians consider the Kali Yuga to go back tens of thousands of years, I'm pretty sure. So all of human history and a lot of human prehistory, proto-history, would all be Kali Yuga. I mean, there's no recollection of anything other than Kali Yuga, except in like mythology. So I do think that there's a correlation. That I do have the wizard theory with regard to like certain prehistoric monoliths, like huge rocks that have been moved for many miles and like maybe dragged or moved up mountain slopes in order to have this huge temple or what, a shrine or whatever the hell it is. That it may be that you had powerful magicians or powerful priests, you know, sort of channeling the power of some small g god that was helping this to happen, that it was instrumental in the building of some of these things. I can't rule out that possibility. And now that we have science and just materialism in general, just European objectivity, that the odds of that sort of thing go down because people just don't believe in it anymore. They want to believe that, you know, this is an orderly universe that follows laws of physics and so forth. And so they just don't have the faith in that to allow it to happen. Like the New Testament, that's one of the main messages of the New Testament. You know, setting aside, you know, Paul and like the general epistle of John, like the synoptic gospels, let's say. One of the main teachings of Jesus in the synoptic gospels is, you know, faith can move mountains. I mean, it's like even when he was healing the sick and they got better and they thanked him, it's your own faith that did it. And that kind of faith or magic or the miraculous or whatever is certainly less now than it was in ancient times, just because people just don't believe in it much. So did modern science develop, though, because magic is not as powerful nowadays in modern times? I think there may be like some interaction. I don't think that it was just like that is the one thing that caused it. It's just sort of the Western mind was, you know, starting with the Greeks, maybe even before the Greeks, was just kind of moving in this direction of increased objectivity and sort of philosophical explanations of things in an orderly manner that just kind of ruled out magic. Gradually over time, you know, magic just kind of got sidelined. Less people believed in it, less people had faith in it, so it just couldn't happen as much. Although there was sort of like a pushback, I think, like in the 1800s, there was kind of a pushback towards more magical thinking, like spiritualism and faith healing and that sort of thing. Mainly as like, I see it possibly, hypothetically, as one last major pushback against science after Darwin came along. Because Darwin just, I mean, he just laid waste to religious thinking to a large degree. That before Darwin, it was like, well, okay, there's laws of physics and all that, but how do you explain us being here? And then on came Chuck Darwin. And, I mean, he just kind of, that was one of the last holdouts, really, for a lot of Christians. So he's my favorite. He's my favorite scientist, I think. Even though a lot of people nowadays are just like staunchly anti-Darwinian, and not just Christian creationists either. So, yeah, I think modern science, it pretty much reduced the possibility of magic, but I don't think that, let's see. Yeah, I think it's the other way around. I don't think that it was magic declining that caused science to arise. It was more like science arising helped magic to decline. So I think it goes the other way. I hope, because that's what I just said. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from PSA. And PSA, he has gotten into a phase of asking joke questions, jokes that are not entirely serious, which includes this first one. What is the true meaning of Christmas? And anyone who wants to know the true meaning of Christmas, watch How the Grinch Stole Christmas. You know, it explains it all in the movie, especially towards the end. But aside from that, I mean, to a Christian, the meaning of Christmas is just celebrating Jesus's birthday. But at first, they didn't really know when Jesus's birthday was. I think the earliest recorded celebration of Christmas was in the springtime, back in Roman times. Then it got moved to January, which the Eastern Orthodox Christians still celebrate Christmas in January, I'm pretty sure. But in the western half of the Roman Empire, where people spoke Latin and were more influenced by Roman Italian culture, that it was just sort of like a political move from the Christians to just replace the main pagan Roman holiday, which was Saturnalia, with Christmas. But again, if you want to know the true meaning of Christmas, watch How the Grinch Stole Christmas. The cartoon version or the live action version, it doesn't matter. They both pretty much teach the same message. And so I'm going to move on to PSA's second question, which is, would you like to be reborn as a proverbial skunk in a Georgia pine tree? No. Okay, so let's see. PSA's third question. When you drink alcohol, this is actually a serious question now. When you drink alcohol, it initially has a calming effect that relieves stress. However, if you keep drinking, you start getting buzzed and then drunk. Does the fifth precept refer to not drinking at all, not even a single drop, or does it refer to not drinking until you get drunk? So that's a fair question. And for a monk, let's just start with the rules for a monk. A monk doesn't follow just the 5 precepts. He follows more than 2,000 rules that are found in the Vinaya Pitaka, the rules of monastic discipline. And for a monk, even 1 drop, even if you drink it accidentally, you have broken the rule and you have to make confession for it. Like, I mentioned this before. I was given medicine before. And I asked, it was like a liquid medicine. You take a spoonful of it or something. I asked, does this have alcohol in it? And they said, no alcohol. So then I take a spoonful of it, and it's like, 90 proof. It's strong alcohol. So I had to make confession for that. Or somebody offers you like grape juice, and grape juice ferments really easily. That's one reason how wine was invented, I assume, because grape juice ferments more easily than something like apple juice. I don't know why. That's just my experience. So it's the hot season. You have no electricity. You have no refrigerator. And somebody offers you this bottle of grape juice, fresh squeezed. And so you don't drink it right away. You drink it maybe hours later that same day, and it's already starting to taste like wine. Well, you broke the rule. Doesn't matter if you get drunk or not. It's just even 1 drop of alcohol, you consume that. Unless it's like so diluted down, like in a curry or something. Somebody cooks with wine, the alcohol all boils out, and there's just like maybe a very slight flavoring of it, but no alcohol still, that kind of thing. Or it's just so diluted down that it's imperceptible. Then you really haven't broken the rule. But I assume that the 5 precepts for lay people, it would be similar for a monk, where you don't have to get drunk. Just to have a beer, just to have one drink of beer would already be violating the precept. I'm not so sure about a layperson drinking, or let's not say drinking, just taking a small amount of cough syrup that has some alcohol in it, that kind of thing. Or they use mouthwash that has some alcohol in it and they accidentally swallow like a tiny amount of it. That it all depends on how much of a stickler you want to be, how Hasidic you want to be with regard to following 5 precepts. But in all likelihood, for lay people as well as for monks, just any amount of alcohol that you drink, especially if you do it on purpose. For monks, even if it's accidental, you still have to make confession. For a lay person, I don't know. I'm not 100% sure whether a lay person has broken the precept by accidentally taking a sip of alcohol, or, just some tiny, just a drop of it, that kind of thing, if they don't do it on purpose. But might as well just go with the same standards that monks have, which mean even if you have a tiny amount accidentally, you've still broken the rule. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, have you read the chapter, The 18 Faults of a Monastery, in the Visuddhimagga? If yes, what do you think about it, and do you agree? If not, I strongly recommend you to read this chapter. Well, as it turns out, I looked in the Visuddhimagga earlier today, and I did not find that chapter in the table of contents. It's not a complete chapter, I'm pretty sure. It might be like a subsection, but I didn't even see the subsection mentioned. I went through the table of contents like twice. I didn't want to go through the entire book. But I have read, assuming that it's in the Visuddhimagga, I have read it, because I have read the entire Visuddhimagga. But that was when I was like a junior monk long ago. And so only certain parts of the Visuddhimagga really stand out. It's like the overview of the 13 Dhutangas, or optional ascetic practices. That was one part that I was instructed to read by one of my first teachers. And just the overview of the 32 parts of the body, which is more of an anthropological study than any kind of like medical or anatomical study. It just shows you what the ancient Indians believed about how your body works. So that it's actually your liver that circulates blood, or actually it doesn't even really circulate. They didn't have a concept of the circulatory system. So they just thought that your liver just kind of is splashing the blood around inside your body. The heart is the origin of thought. It's not even a blood pumping organ. And your brain is just bone marrow filling a large hollow brain. And they didn't even know what possible purpose it could have. I think I mentioned before that one of the most objective empirical statements in that section, where Buddhaghosa, the author of the book, is talking about the 32 parts of the body, is he makes the observation that if your spleen protrudes from your body through like an injury, you die. They had learned that much empirical medicine to know if your spleen comes out, you die. Although it may be in some cases, especially nowadays, you've got like antiseptics and so forth, you could kind of poke it back in and sew the person's torso back together, and they might be okay. So the 18 Faults of a Monastery, I kind of vaguely remember. I have read, I think there's suttas that discuss, signs of decline in a monastery. I could probably guess with fair accuracy what some of the faults of a monastery would be. Too close to a town, or too far away from a town, or too noisy, or, too many lay people visiting, especially the women all dressed in pretty clothes and all that. But again, it's just, I read it a long time ago and it does not come to mind. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, during your cave dwelling days, did the bitter masters, loneliness and boredom, call on you often? And no, not really. I used to think to myself that the only time I'd ever really get bored as a monk is if I had to sit through a long-winded discourse by some Burmese Sayadaw. You just have to sit there and pretend like you're listening really. And I mean, I'd get bored with, not when I was by myself, but when I was with people that really we did not share the same point of view or the same understanding of the world in general or of Dhamma in particular. You know, we just weren't on the same page. And so I just have to be polite and just kind of have good manners until it was all over with. So I really do not get bored or lonely very easily. I mean, there were a few times as a monk where I would feel like, man, it'd be good to hang out with my old buddy Mucus Man again. But that was about it, really. Maybe kind of loneliness for a woman, you know, sort of like the mating instinct would arise sometimes, but I don't suppose Rui was specifically referring to that. But I mean, I could just live in a cave with bare walls, you know, and just not be bored. I mean, when a major part of your job is just kind of feeling the sensation of air as it goes in and out of your nostrils, a person like that generally doesn't get bored very easily. If you can do that for hours every day. So, yeah, I was just blessed, I suppose, in not being particularly prone to loneliness or boredom. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mogambo. And Mogambo says, what are your views on memory? And this is memory. It's a subtle thing that's difficult to explain. That some people will use memory as like an argument for self-view. You know, if there's no self, then who is it that remembers this stuff? How does memory work? But from a phenomenological point of view, I'm not sure if I'm using the word correctly, but there has to be a certain continuity in order for us to have like an existence going through samsara as a perceived individual. I mean, there has to be some continuity from one moment to the next. If you have complete amnesia and don't remember what happened one moment before or anything that happened before the present, I mean, there's no way you could be a kind of sentient being. I mean, you just be like in this state of, I don't know what it would be. You know, so you're seeing everything for the first time every moment. You don't know what anything is. You wouldn't know how to use language. That's a kind of memory. You'd just be like, I mean, you'd be like an idiot. So there has to be some kind of memory for mentality in the human sense of the word in order for it to exist at all. So that's how memory, that's why memory works. From just this, you know, setting aside neurophysiology and all that, just like from the personal experience of being alive in samsara, you have to have memory because, I mean, your mind is changing from one moment to the next. You have to have change, but you also have to have continuity. And in a way, that's sort of like the middle path. In a way, you could call it kind of dependent co-arising. And I always intended to write an essay on this, and I don't think I ever did. But, I mean, there has to be a balance between like Shiva and Vishnu, or like Dionysus and Apollo. There has to be a balance between change and stasis, things remaining the same but also changing. Because you can't have 2 moments in a row of nothing changing, because you wouldn't even be aware of it. I mean, it's like the passage of time is measured by change. So, I mean, with regard to, you want to go the scientific route, then, you know, neurophysiology, they've got their own theories on how memory works. They don't fully understand how memory works even now. You know, they don't know if it's sort of like a special area in your brain that stores a memory, or if it's just like your entire brain has sort of like a memory hologram or something. They haven't fully worked that part out yet. Maybe they never will. Who knows? Memory in a computer is pretty straightforward. But memory, just from the point of view of like just dealing with what you're experiencing directly. And maybe going through the filter of perception, because that's the way an unenlightened mind works. A samsaric mind. You just have to have memories. And so whether it even really existed or not, I mean, it's not even necessary for your memories even to be true. And I've found that some of my memories have changed over time. Like as a monk, I would remember certain things, like an old TV commercial about Tootsie Pops, or just some song on an album that I used to really like. And then after I stopped being a monk, or I just came back to the West to visit my family or something, I'd see that same old commercial that was like this vintage classic commercial now, and it was different than I clearly remembered it. Or that song that I really liked, it turned out that I took the lyrics from one song and the melody from another and had just conflated them so that it wasn't, I remembered the song wrong too, even though I'd been like playing it in my head for years. So memories aren't even necessarily factual. It's just this mental image that is maintained through karmic momentum that you use to build your personality and your experience on. But it's a subtle topic, and it's hard to explain very coherently. And so I'm just going to move on to Mogambo's second question. And I think this is also about memory. Information is shared between similar species through a language. What would be the mechanism of memories, momentum from past life, to be transferred from one life to another? Well, memories generally do not transfer from one life to another. You've got, the karmic momentum, but it doesn't necessarily come across as memory. Most people do not remember anything from before they were born. In fact, most people don't remember anything from before they were about 3 years old. So the mechanism of memories to be transferred from one life to another, I'm not even sure if you could even call it a mechanism, because as a general rule, it's an exception to the rule. That there are like some kids or some people who are hypnotized, or just some people who are unusual who can remember past lives. Like my father claimed to be able to remember several of his past lives to some degree. And you read Ian Stevenson's books about little kids who insist that they're not that little kid. They're this grown-up who ran a pharmacy 20 miles away and died from falling off a wagon, this kind of thing. So what the exact mechanism of that would be is maybe like your ego structure defining your existence in this world has gaps that are allowing information from a previous existence to bleed through. But why he says this top part, information, the first part of the question, information is shared between similar species through a language. Similar, maybe he means the same species. But you don't even have to have similar species for there to be some kind of communication. Because, for example, when I lived in central Burma, there were lots of little owls called zikwet. There were lots of wild jungle fowl, like wild chickens. And there were also lots of squirrels. And they would all have an alarm call. If they saw a hawk flying by, they'd make a certain sound, and the other species would also know that is an alarm call. That means they probably saw something scary. And so, like, an owl would make this little chirping noise, is like an alarm call. And it's like the squirrels and the jungle fowl would just run for cover. So it was like interspecies communication. They were all sharing alarm calls. One kind of interesting thing about alarm calls I read in a book on animal behavior is that many alarm calls that various species of animal have are specifically designed to be difficult to locate. Like if it's a mating call, you want to be able to locate, you want the female bird to locate you who is making the mating call. But if it's an alarm call, you don't want the hawk to be able to locate you from the sound. So they have a more diffuse kind of like the phonetic, or not the phonetics, the acoustics of it are different. So that it's harder to actually know exactly where the alarm call is coming from. That's just throwing a little behavioral biology in there. So what would be the mechanism of memories to be transferred from one life to another? Yeah, like I said, I guess that my best explanation would be that, you've got some person who, they still have like gaps in their ego or in their self-image that is allowing information from a previous life to somehow bleed through in a paranormal kind of way. But it is uncommon among human beings. Most people do not remember past lives. And I remember one time somebody asked me, why is it that we don't remember our past lives? And my answer at the time was, we have a different brain. So the info recorded, going with the idea of like empirical scientism or whatever, that, clearly you got a different brain. And so it's like you got a different computer. It's got different memory storage, and the stuff that was on your previous computer just isn't stored on this new computer because you didn't have a backup. You fucked up on that one. But I'm not exactly sure what Mogambo is angling towards in this question, unless he spills the beans in this third question, which is as follows. As humans, we are a product of our parents, and we could trace it back to the past. No, let me just start over. I got to tilt my head back. As humans, we are a product of our parents, and we could trace it back in the past all the way to first cell on the planet, at which stage does that memory enters the new body. I personally do not believe in a concept of karma. Oops, I let the computer, there we go. Okay. Let's see, I personally do not believe in concept of karma, but still want to know if it's true, then what is the process of it? And yeah, I don't think he really understands what karma is based on this question, because karma is not some kind of cellular genetic memory. In fact, karma isn't really understood by very many people, including very many Buddhists, because a lot of people are just stuck in this idea that karma is just a system of rewards and punishments. It's like you do this, you get rewarded or punished for it. Maybe in this life, maybe in a future life. And that is a very simplistic view of karma. That karma, in a way, is the momentum of your mental states. And so one example of karma that even a scientist couldn't really deny is just the whole idea of the automatic pilot. I've written an essay on this before, where just like a first step in understanding what karma really is, not just this magical rewards and punishments coming from outer space or something, that like anything that you do that isn't fully conscious is karmic. And it's like we are governed by habit, that karma is itself a kind of habit energy. There was a book called the Buddhist Bible, which was mostly Mahayana stuff, but they had this intriguing rendering of karma as habit energy in the book. And that is really a remarkably good translation for karma. It's habit energy. It's just, if you're not fully awake, you're just acting out on automatic pilot. And that automatic pilot is your karma. So, you don't believe in the concept of karma. According to Buddhism, karma is volition. Karma is cetana. Karma is will. So if you don't believe in karma, if karma is will, then you don't believe in will or volition either, which would make you kind of a radical skeptic, or maybe some kind of very advanced Buddhist mystic who has just gone beyond samsaric, differentiation. But if you think that will exists, then karma exists, even though you might have different ideas about how it works. than some orthodox Buddhist scholar does. But like I already said, one stage beyond just believing in will as karma, it's this habit energy. And it's just running your life for you because you're not fully awake yet. You're still sleepwalking in a sense. Almost everybody is like this. That we all have these habitual things that we do, and you don't even have to be fully aware of what you're doing. I mean, you could be thinking about something completely different. You've done it so many times that it's just automatic. Driving a car is kind of like that. You don't have to think about what you're doing. It's just automatic. It's just, you can be thinking about completely other stuff while driving on the freeway at 70 miles an hour in heavy traffic. So that's one reason why Buddhists practice mindfulness, is to bring you into the present moment so that you're not just governed by knee-jerk habitual reactions all the time. And when you are completely freed of knee-jerk habitual reactions, you are freed from karma, at least from making new karma. When you are fully conscious and you're no longer just a meat puppet acting out through force of habit, then you're not making new karma anymore. Because you're making karma when you're acting through force of habit. And it may be you're doing something new for the first time, but still you've got associated habits, just momentum that are shaping your like feelings about what you're doing and your reaction to what you did and all that. So let's just get back to the question though, which is kind of a strange question. At which stage does that memory enter the new body? And he's talking about some kind of cellular or genetic memory that, I mean, the genetics are going to be there, just sort of stored. It's like data storage in your DNA. I mean, that happens immediately. As soon as the egg and the sperm come together and form a zygote, you know, the earliest stage of an embryo already, that's all there. But with regard to actual memories, I mean, racial memory, I'm not even sure if that exists other than just like animal instincts that we share that cause our psychology to be pretty similar. I think I'm just going to move on to this question. And this is from someone who I think maybe is Polish, and they've got a name that I cannot pronounce. And so I'm just going to do the same thing I do to French people and just call him Nazaiwial. The L at the end has a line through it, so it's not pronounced like an L. I think the Z isn't pronounced like a real Z. And the Polish are kind of confused with regard to this sort of thing, I think. So anyways, Nazaiwial says, when it comes to the Dhamma, there is not many good Western teachers, in my opinion. Do you have any advice for a guy straight out from high school? Man, well, I'd have different advice for different guys straight out of high school. I mean, just the average guy straight out of high school. I mean, I wouldn't have even general advice for him, really. I mean, you'd have to have some knowledge of the guy straight out of high school. I mean, does he want to renounce the world? Does he want to live like a virtuous lay life? I mean, what does he want? I mean, what kind of direction does he even want to head in? So there's that. But I mean, this first sentence, which isn't even necessarily related to the second, when it comes to the Dhamma, there is not many good Western teachers, in my opinion. Well, I mean, there's that one in, where is he, Serbia? I mean, he's fairly close to a country where people are called Nazaiwial. So there's that, I guess. I mean, if you want to learn Dhamma, I mean, there are good Dhamma teachers out there. And it may be that Nazaiwial is just asking about that. Do you have any advice for a guy straight out from high school about learning Dhamma from a good teacher? That might be what he is implying, what he means here. So, yeah, strangely, I guess his name is Jnanavira. No, Jnanamoli. Jnanamoli in Serbia, I think. He's a good teacher. There are actually good Dhamma teachers. And I mean, good Western teachers, they're out there. And anyone who's got like a favorite teacher that they think is really, really wise could put in the comments who they think is a really good teacher. Like there's the two monks in Seattle who are good teachers, even though they're kind of in the dragon's lair in Seattle and having to be accommodating to like real radical leftist types sometimes, I think. But they definitely are out there. There's what's his name? Ajahn Martin in Thailand. Some people think he's a very good teacher. So, I mean, you can find them if you look for them, if that is really what you want. But for a guy straight out of high school, I mean, I would have to know the guy straight out from high school in order to have some idea as to what kind of advice he needs. Because not all guys straight out from high school need the same advice. You know, do good, avoid doing evil, and purify your mind. That would be good advice for anybody, I think. And by golly, all of a sudden, we're at the last question. And this is also from a person who lives in Poland, and his name is Czerzaskaziz. So Czerzaskaziz says, how do you think language we use, not personal choice of words, but the first language like English, Burmese, or Polish, said English, influence or change our perception of reality? And this has been studied by some guy named Benjamin Worf, I think is his name, called the Worfian hypothesis. I think originally he and somebody else came up with this hypothesis together, but Worf wound up getting most of the credit. I'm not talking about the Klingon. It was like a human. And he had this idea that really it's our language determines how we can perceive things. And I think a lot of people who just lived in the same culture their entire life, or if they have traveled, they've traveled to countries where still the point of view is similar. They really may not have much insight into understanding this. But you move to a country, you spend a considerable amount of time in a country where the language is very different and the whole way of looking at things is correspondingly different. Or it's like in Burmese, there are words that there's really no English translation for. In English, there are words that there's no Burmese translation for. Like I've mentioned owls. There's lots and lots of owls in Burma. There's no word for owl in the Burmese language. It's just each kind of owl has its own name. You've got like the Maingaon, you've got the Ziquet, you've got the so. There's all these. There's the Miwon. There's all these different kinds of owls, but there's no word just for owl. Also, there's lots of lizards in Burma. No word just for lizard. And so that's going to cause their thinking to be different. I've mentioned before that like what in English is called brown, if you look up into an English to Burmese dictionary, it will say that the Burmese word for brown is anyo. But brown and anyo, they've got a lot of overlap, but still they're not exactly the same color. They're not the same ranges of colors. That there are colors that would be called anyo that are not brown. And there's colors that might be called brown that are not anyo. And so it's like the words that you use for understanding this world, like the generalizations, and all language is almost entirely composed of generalizations. I think it was Bertrand Russell said there's only two words in the English language that are not generalizations, and that is this and that. So definitely the language that you use is going to have a profound impact on the way you think about things. And I do think that's one reason why the Indo-European language families, the Proto-Indo-Europeans who presumably arose in the Pontic steppes, 7,000 years ago or something, they spread throughout much of the old world, throughout much of the Eastern Hemisphere, not including Africa really, until in modern times it got into Africa. Well, I guess you'd have like Greek and Latin being spoken in northern Africa in ancient times. But one reason why I think the Indo-Europeans were so successful is they had a powerful language where they could think things that other people couldn't think because they just didn't have the words for it. So I think that's one reason why the Indo-Europeans were so successful, is just not only did they have like strong, robust kind of bodies, and also an appreciation for violence that made them successful. And also they were clever and were inventing things like chariots, that kind of thing, that maybe it was just their language skills, the way that they were able to think because of their language, that caused them to be more innovative or more objective or whatever, and just made their culture a little bit stronger and gave them a little bit more of an edge against other cultures that they were sooner or later in competition with, or just flat out warfare. So, I mean, I remember reading as a kid in the Guinness Book of World Records, of all places, that there were some African tribal languages that, I mean, the number system only went up to like 5, maybe even less than 5. It just went up like 1, 2, 3, many. And I mean, that is definitely going to have a serious influence on how you perceive a reality. If you can't count higher than 5 because you just don't have numbers for it, and your culture just doesn't really have room for that sort of thing, then yeah, I mean, it's you're just limited. There's like the Pali language is very subtle with regard to intellectual states or mental states. You know, it's like meditative experiences. You can describe those kind of things more easily in Pali than in certain other languages, like possibly English, although English is a very powerful language, which is one reason why it's sort of like the main lingua franca of the earth at this point. It's a difficult language to learn, but still. What else should I say about this before we call it quits? How do you think the language we use, not personal choice of words, but the first language like English, Burmese, or Polish, influence or change our perception of reality? Yeah, it's just like a different tinge. It's just sort of like a different, subtly different cultural attitude. Like, I have read that in English, you can discuss Protestant Christianity much more easily in English than you can discuss just about any other religious system, just because Protestant Christianity and modern English grew up together, and they're just sort of like, you know, they've sort of evolved in a kind of like cultural symbiosis. But it's fairly subtle. You know, it's like you can talk with the Burmese people, with Burmese person, like in Burmese or in English, either way. And for the most part, you understand, you know, what the other person is saying. Although every once in a while, there's just going to be certain assumptions that are made, or just the language that you use, talking about something that's brown, for example, it's just going to cause just a sort of communication barrier or culture barrier. And I've read that like Indian Buddhist texts are different from Chinese Buddhist texts because Indian languages, you know, they're Indo-European languages that are very kind of precise, objective kind of language, whereas in China, it's a different kind of philosophy, subtly different, where it's more intuitive, and you know, the words are not nearly as precise, and you just kind of have to fill in the blanks. And Burmese is kind of like that too. Burmese is more closely related to Chinese than it is to Indo-European languages, although it has a lot of loan words from Indo-European languages. So, yeah, I mean, it is going to influence your attitude along with other cultural elements, just because of the words that you're able to think, the ideas you're able to have, the concepts you're able to generate are going to differ if the language differs and the words are different. And that's it. I think I'm done. My golly, that's about 2 hours exactly. So this is kind of a short one, actually. So as I should always say at the beginning and never do, if you got any questions you think I can answer, especially about like Theravada Buddhism, early Buddhism, meditation, Indian philosophy, Eastern philosophy, even Western philosophy, biology, I guess, me personally, living in Burma, that kind of thing, then yeah, feel free to ask the questions. And no more than 3 questions per episode, please. And just, if you're unsure of how many questions you got, just count the question marks. It's a fairly easy way. And like and subscribe if you have not done so already. And be happy.